Germany jumps off the globalist train. NATO officials continue to present fallacious arguments in an attempt to convince Donald Trump to change his stance on the Ukraine war. But will this become a reality, especially when the West is suffering more significant losses with every escalation, while Ukraine is forced to fight to the last soldier? We will continue to analyze this topic in today's video. The detailed content is coming right up. Comprehensive assault on Ukraine's defense system in Donetsk. The most challenging situation for the Ukrainian armed forces is unfolding in Kharkiv. According to the map from the Deep State Channel, the Russian military has advanced to the western part of the city, and much of this area has become a gray zone. The Ukrainian military reports that Russian forces are advancing through the area of high-rise buildings and have destroyed the industrial zone of Kharkiv. An officer with the nickname Alex stated that in the city center, Ukraine's defense forces had collapsed. Fighting is also ongoing in the village of Stary Turny, northwest of Kharkiv. Losing Stary Turny would threaten the only supply route for Ukrainian units stationed in Kharkiv. At the same time, holding the industrial zone next to the reservoir will be extremely difficult, as two pincers will attack it. Currently, Russian forces have reached the defensive positions and are destroying enemy bunkers with anti-tank mines. In the Kharkiv region, the Russians have crossed the Oskol River by boat, approaching the village of Masyutivka, Russia's second bridgehead on the west bank of the Oskol. They are now trying to establish a foothold south of Dvorikna. Fighting continues near the bridgehead, close to Novomlinsk. Ukrainian MP Mariana Bezuglaya has criticized that the enemy's crossing of the Oskol River and further advances toward the settlements of Borova, Izium, and Balaklia are due to the failure of the military to construct defensive fortifications along the Oskol River. Meanwhile, on the Kursk front, BBC reported on December 2nd that the Ukrainian military is exhausted, but has been ordered to hold out until Trump takes office. Ukrainian soldiers interviewed sounded grim, even angry, as they confirmed that the situation in Kursk was worsening by the day. Nearly 4 months after the Ukrainian army launched a lightning offensive into Russia's Kursk region, messages from Ukrainian soldiers fighting there have painted a bleak picture of a battle they don't fully understand and fear they may lose. These soldiers spoke about the harsh weather conditions and constant sleep deprivation caused by Russia's relentless bombings, including terrifying 3-ton glide bombs. A commanding officer named Pavlo spoke about extreme fatigue, the lack of rotation, and how reinforcements mainly consisted of middle-aged men. Notably, these reinforcements were brought directly from other fronts without time for rest. The soldiers also confirmed that the Ukrainian army is retreating, while Russian forces are gradually reclaiming territory. However, their mission is to hold on to this small piece of land until Trump takes office and negotiations begin. In other words, they are tasked with holding on to as much Russian territory as possible to have something to trade when the time comes for talks. BBC reported that in October alone, Russia seized more than 500 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory, while Ukraine lost about 40% of the territory it had captured in Kursk in August. Despite their determination to hold on to Kursk, the morale of the Ukrainian soldiers BBC spoke with is severely deteriorating. They endure harsh weather conditions and the pressure of the enemy's dangerous firepower. Under such circumstances, BBC left the conclusion open. As for how long the Ukrainian army can hold out in Kursk, the answer is quite simple. Furthermore, BBC also acknowledged that the US, UK, and France allowing Kiev to use long-range weapons to strike targets inside Russia has had little effect on boosting the morale of the soldiers fighting in Kursk. According to Officer Pavlo, missiles like ATACMS and Storm Shadow can devastate command centers and ammunition depots deep within Russian territory. Still, they are far too distant for the soldiers on the front lines to feel their impact. Meanwhile, internal Ukrainian sources report that Trump's team has once again directed President Zelensky's advisors about the necessity of preventing further escalation of the war and halting missile attacks on Russia. However, this poses a challenge for Kyiv, as it would significantly weaken President Zelensky's negotiating position. Kyiv faces a serious dilemma: how to escalate the war while not damaging its relationship with Trump and preserving its energy infrastructure. Germany jumps off the globalist train, supports Trump's peace negotiations for Ukraine. Yesterday, December 2nd, Western media reported that in November, Russian forces continued their advance at a record pace, and with the most enormous scale since the beginning of the conflict. According to reports, the Russian military seized 725 square kilometers in November, compared to 610 square kilometers in October. Moreover, Russia's success in October also marked a record for the past 2.5 years of the war. Western media suggest that the lack of troops is the primary reason behind Ukraine's defeats, citing the White House's call for Ukraine to lower the age of military conscription. The Washington Post reported yesterday, December 2nd, that the Biden administration is disappointed by Zelensky's inability to ensure the necessary troop reinforcements for the Ukrainian military. The newspaper noted that the White House remains frustrated with Ukrainian leaders resisting the U.S. call to lower the conscription age from 25 to 18. It also mentioned the gap in ammunition between Ukraine and Russia may not have been fully closed, but the situation has improved significantly. However, from a workforce perspective, Kyiv has not mobilized and trained enough soldiers to replace the losses on the battlefield. The newspaper also reported that the Biden administration will try to provide additional weapons worth billions of dollars to Ukraine at the last minute, even though this may deplete weapon supplies for other hotspots. In summary, the current U.S. administration still does not believe that the Ukrainian front will collapse shortly. In the long run, they see the increasingly severe workforce shortages in Ukraine's forces leading to the exhaustion of its military. The U.S. announced a new military aid package for Ukraine worth $725 million. The White House stated that in the remaining 50 days of Biden's administration, they will do everything possible to send as many weapons to Ukraine as possible. This is the view of the Democratic Party, but the incoming Trump administration holds a different stance. On November 28th, Trump's Ukraine envoy, Keith Kellogg, summarized the key points in his peace plan. This report, which was submitted to Trump in April, before the election cycle began, includes several key points, such as, first, ending Russia's isolation, restoring relations with Moscow, and ending the demonization of Putin. The Guardian wrote, Kellogg and Flights criticized what they said was a decision to scold Vladimir Putin and threaten unprecedented sanctions as the U.S. prepared to invade Ukraine, instead of using negotiations to de-escalate tensions. Second, pressure Ukraine and Russia to agree to a ceasefire and begin negotiations. The report proposed halting the next round of U.S. military aid to Ukraine if Kyiv does not engage in peace talks with Moscow. It also warned Moscow that if it refuses negotiations, the U.S. will send additional weapons to Ukraine. Third, consider Russia's interest in the event of a ceasefire agreement, including delaying Ukraine's NATO membership for an extended period, possibly 10 years, allowing Russia to retain the territories it has seized from Ukraine, gradually lifting sanctions on Russia, and normalizing U.S.-Russia relations. Fourth, consider Ukraine's interests, continue military support, and ensure bilateral security for Ukraine. At the same time, Kyiv would not be required to recognize Russia's control over its territories formally, but must refrain from changing the status quo through military force. Fifth, criticize the Biden administration for serving globalist agendas, including its stance on Russia and its weakness toward China. The Guardian wrote, it blames unserious and incoherent U.S. foreign policy under Joe Biden for the 3-year conflict, including what it describes as a precipitous U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the supposed antagonization of U.S. allies, including Israel and Saudi Arabia, and a policy toward China described as weak and confusing. We want to remind you that Mr. Kellogg's plan was published in April, long before Trump's victory. Therefore, Trump's official peace plan for Ukraine cannot be considered. However, it does provide initial ideas for ending the war. These ideas and changes in the battlefield dynamics will likely be considered before Trump makes his final decision. However, Trump's stance on Ukraine will not be solely influenced by General Kellogg. As reported in yesterday's video, after his electoral victory, Trump called Hungarian Prime Minister Orban several times and sought his advice on building a peace process with Russia. It is known that Prime Minister Orban supports lifting sanctions on Russia, halting the war at the front lines, and pursuing negotiations, which would include broader European security issues. Notably, Orban's position aligns more closely with Russia's views than General Kellogg's. Therefore, it cannot be ruled out that Trump might initiate a dialogue with President Putin, taking into account the opinions of Prime Minister Orban. At the same time, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz visited Kyiv yesterday for the first time in 2.5 years, actively positioning himself as a potential participant in upcoming peace negotiations. According to Bild, His visit aimed to understand Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's views on the situation and the peace terms that Ukrainian society might accept. Recently, Chancellor Scholz had a phone conversation with President Putin, which led to criticism from Zelensky. Scholz, however, defended the call, arguing that it was necessary to restore the diplomatic process. Chancellor Scholz is trying to align with Trump and Orban in pushing for peace talks, in contrast to the UK and France, which are still closely tied to the outgoing Biden administration. NATO Secretary General warns Trump a bad Ukraine peace deal would be a serious threat to the US and Europe. NATO Secretary General is trying to maintain a tough stance ahead of Donald Trump's inauguration. He is undoubtedly aware of the difficulties that Brussels may face, as during Trump's first term, he criticized NATO member countries for not spending enough on defense and for relying too much on Washington's security umbrella. In an interview with the Financial Times, Mark Rutte warned Trump that if Ukraine is pressured into signing a bad peace agreement that favors Russia, the United States and Europe will face a terrible threat from Iran, China, and North Korea. According to him, all these rogue nations have deepened their relationships with Russia throughout the nearly 3-year-long war in Ukraine. Specifically, North Korea and Russia signed a defense treaty in June, leading to the deployment of approximately 10,000 North Korean troops to the Kursk region to support Russia. They are all cooperating to bypass sanctions led by the United States. Like the hawkish view in the U.S., Rutte has sought to frame the outcome of the Eastern European conflict as critically important for the freedom of Taiwan. According to the Financial Times, Rutte noted the risk from Russia supplying missile technology to North Korea and cash to Iran. In an apparent reference to Taiwan, he said that Chinese President Xi Jinping might get thoughts about something else in the future if there is not a good deal for Ukraine. In other words, according to the NATO Secretary General, at that point, Pyongyang, Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran would look at the Ukraine situation for additional motivation to challenge the West. In the long run, this would pose a terrible security threat to Europe and the United States. He is trying to persuade Trump to maintain the hardline stance of the Biden administration. He attempts to use a Cold War-era domino theory mindset to warn Trump. This thinking can be described as follows. If enemy X is not stopped here, then enemy Y will also feel encouraged and seek to conquer militarily. Rutte points out that Russia is transferring missile technology to North Korea, which poses a grave threat not only to South Korea and Japan, but also to the continental United States. He also mentions that Iran is receiving money from Russia in exchange for missiles and drone technology, which Iran then uses to support Hezbollah and Hamas. Based on this, the NATO Secretary General concludes that Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia are cooperating closely, and the leaders of these countries are becoming more aligned. This viewpoint is similar to that of the hawkish Western faction, which argues that if Russia is not stopped, it could attack Europe or some NATO member states in the Baltic or Eastern Europe. However, the reality is that Russia has never shown any intention to attack Europe, let alone NATO. Furthermore, as we have analyzed in previous videos, Russia maintains an independent stance with Iran. It respects its close relationship with Israel while valuing its ties with India and keeping a distance from China, even being wary of Beijing's insidious intentions towards Russia's Far East region. The closer ties between Russia and these two countries only began when the West's hostile policies intensified, culminating in the proxy war in Ukraine. Moreover, reality has proven that the mindset of using power to suppress power while failing to take concrete actions has caused significant damage to the West. Therefore, the statements of the NATO Secretary General are just a form of sophistry often used by far-left politicians. Our commentary concludes here today. Thank you for your attention and for following along. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episodes.